Can you tell us about your first encounter with Milton Erickson and how it impacted your life?
Yeah, so about a year into my relationship with Banling Rinder, The Structure of Magic came out, and Gregory Bateson, who lived on the same property as Banling Rinder, the publisher of Structure of Magic, had that property. And Bateson said, if you guys, Banling Rinder, he was very impressed with the Structure of Magic 1, he said, if you guys really want to know anything about communication, go study the great purple one out in the desert. Milton Erickson could only see the color purple, so he was the purple one before Prince, the artist formerly known as Prince.
Yeah.
And he said, go study with my old friend. And they had known each other for like 50 years. They were very good friends. So Banling Rinder went out, and they came back with audio, the tape recordings and articles and so forth. And something just like touched me so deeply. It felt like, this is why I'm here.
Yeah.
I mean, this voice.
You knew it.
Yeah. And so that NLP community, and it wasn't really NLP yet, it was at that point I think still called the meta model groups. It became like an Erickson faction, if you will, a segment. And I would say I was probably the most impassioned. So when they went back out 2 months later, they invited me to go with them. And I was doing these deep trance identifications with Erickson. I say it was a youthful time. And I had a purple wheelchair that we found at some secondhand store. And some of the time I was partly hypnotically paralyzed, and I was channeling Erickson.
Wow.
So, but when I met him, it was a great experience. I mean, he was really, in my lifetime, he was really one of the great ones. I mean, he was the real thing. And I just had this sense of, this is the guy I really want to study with.
Yeah. And in one of your other books you mentioned also that without the deep identification you couldn't have learned from him what you have learned. How did that work?
Well, in this deep trance identification, which is this process, is say the spirit of that time was what's possible. You know, what sort of interesting realities can we discover today? And so one of the things we were doing was reading through all sorts of books, and including reading through all these hypnosis journals.
Yeah.
And we came across this series of articles by a Russian psychologist, Reichel, who was doing these experiments where he'd have people go into deep trance, become in a trance a famous artist like Rembrandt, and then do, for example, painting while they were in a Rembrandt trance, and he found that their performance was superior when they were in that identification trance. So we thought, wow, that's interesting, and so I did it with Erickson. My external perception, and I think often the typical idea of Erickson was like he was just the fastest gun in the West. He was just very clever, and that he was very fast in his thinking. So what I got in that identification trance was two things that I think would have taken me a long time if I would have ever discovered them. The first is everything was totally quiet. There's no internal dialogue. And
so not talking to yourself?
No.
No.
It was just sort of present. Which of course made the perceptual awareness very, very intensive. And then there was a second awareness that everybody was already in the trance. So you didn't have to do a technique to cleverly manipulate. You had to just sense that there was that creative, unconscious intelligence that was already there, and find a way to attune to it and begin to talk with it about it. And that helped me immensely.
And the years when you left Santa Cruz, how did NLP and trance impact your life? So how did you further develop your work, which you already started with Erickson?
Well, those two topics, NLP and trance, I would consider somewhat differently. I started out with that in 1974. I graduated did my undergraduate degree 77, and then I went over the hill to Stanford to do my doctoral work.
Yeah.
And I had a fairly sharp break at that point, and there were different reasons. One was that I just needed to really devote myself to graduate school. The second, there was a little bit too much for me, sort of an isolation of that community, and an unwillingness or a lack of a sort of conversation with groups outside of it. And there was a little bit too much drug, sex, rock and roll for an Irish Catholic kid like me. So, secondly, there was this not insignificant tension between Bandler and Milton Erickson. And you might say that in the divorce, I knew which parent that I wanted to live with. So Erickson initially really liked those guys, and he got pretty fed up with Bandler pretty quickly.
And any specific reason why that was? Or?
Well, I think I would just say there's an old psychiatric adage: never leave put two Napoleons in the same cell.
All right.
I mean, I think I would just leave it at that.
Yeah. And your work went into generative trance later on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, so my connection with Erickson continued, and it really felt like the trance work was really my calling, if you will, and it was the best vehicle for me to do the exploration and development, both professionally and personally, that I felt was most resonant for me. And that work continued in various ways until I'd say about 1992. In 1992, within the space of 4 weeks, my father died and my daughter was born. And the one thing that I could always count on is a connection to trance. I mean, I learned it as a kid. I think it's partly just who I am, but partly growing up in a violent alcoholic family where you learn a lot about how to dissociate.
Yeah.
And so I could always just tune into that trance and feel safe and find some interesting space chums and so forth. But when those two events happened, my doorway to trance just closed. And it was shocking, it was confusing, and I tried to fake it, and one of the main things I always could not tolerate was people faking trance. I mean, people trying to speak hypnotically and not really being congruent about it.
You can see that, you can tell that it's not.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, a person faking playing music.
Yeah.
I mean, a musician is playing music or they're not.
Yeah.
And I think somebody doing trance work is because trance is so musical.
Yeah.
It's the musicality is the first language of the unconscious. So anyway, I was able to finally sit and appreciate from some of the Ericksonian work. Oh, this is supposed to happen. When you develop a symptom, when you have this disconnection, it's the unconscious mind's way of trying to do a transformation. That you're in a death and a rebirth cycle. So sitting with that sort of positive idea, I had this realization that I was nobody's son. I mean, my father had just died, and my daughter was just born. So I was nobody's son, and I was somebody's father. So I had to find my own voice, if you will. And that began the work with the self-relation stuff, which then came back around to generative trance. But I see that, I mean, if you're asking me about this, sort of the chronological unfolding, there's definitely been these different periods.